The Xbox One X released a couple months ago, and it potentially has a lot to live up to. Touted by Microsoft as the first real 4K gaming console, it's charging a premium over the PS4 Pro, with the promise of offering a better gaming experience. Along with that comes the inevitable marketing speak about how the Xbox One X is superior to any comparable computer, and you need to spend quite a bit more money to equal the same quality gameplay experience with a PC. On the one hand, there's some truth to that. The Xbox One X has a number of specific features that would cost a lot more than $500 to build into a PC, like an Ultra HD Blu-ray player and vapor cooling. But you have to keep in mind that it's literally impossible to put together an Xbox that can do everything a PC can do, even if they're both Windows machines that share a lot of games. They're really just totally different systems. So please understand that today we're going to be talking about gaming performance, not every feature of either platform. If you've never seen one of my videos before, I have this series called the Potato Masher, where I take a budget PC and compare it against the PS4, and then I put in a better GPU and compare it against the PS4 Pro. Here are the specs of that PC named the Potato Masher Pro. The goal is not to pick on consoles, but to show budget gamers what type of experience they can expect to have on a PC that costs about the same as a console. Over a year ago, when I started the Potato Masher Pro series, this PC was worth roughly $450. To be fair, the current crypto craze is making it hard to build a good, affordable PC with new parts right now, so it might be hard to match this price to performance ratio with a PC unless you go used, at least for the moment, but normally this is very doable. The hard drive is smaller than the X1 X, and it doesn't have a Blu-ray drive of any kind, but I was curious how gaming performance would compare to the X1 X. The GTX 1060 is a great value graphics card, and I suspect that the X1 X isn't exactly a $1,000 gaming PC equivalent, good as it might be and despite what tons of people on YouTube and other tech blogs who don't know what they're talking about might say. So I installed 6 games that are either popular on the Xbox or have had good X1 X patches. It would be easy to cherry pick bad examples of optimization or graphics tech on either system, but I'd like to see both systems at their best. Both systems were recorded using an Elgato 4K 60 capture card, so there should be no difference in capture quality. I've got time codes below for each game, and before we start, I want to thank everyone who supports me on Patreon. This video cost a lot of money to get going, and I couldn't have done it without your support. Thank you. Alright, let's get to it. Gears of War 4 has 2 modes in the Xbox One X, Performance and Visuals. Performance runs the campaign at a targeted 1080p and 60 FPS, which is a welcome change for a gaming console. Digital Foundry reported rare drops into the 40s, but usually the console manages 55 to 60 FPS. That was about the same as my experience on the PM Pro at 1080p, high settings, 60 FPS, and with dynamic resolution scaling enabled on the PC. This sequence here was one of the roughest I encountered, where the frame rate drops into the low 50s. There isn't any huge noticeable difference in visual quality between the two systems, and 60 FPS makes the entire sequence look fantastic. In this sequence, however, the X1 X does look like the dynamic resolution's running a bit lower than the PC. It didn't appear to be an especially demanding section on PC, so I'm not sure why the Xbox might be lower, but resolution is the largest difference between the two systems here. The Xbox has better shadows in my opinion, but it also has much more noticeable scaling artifacts. The post-process sharpening on the PC looks a bit too strong when you compare it side by side with the Xbox, but played on its own it didn't bother me. The softness of the Xbox is a standout, but in fast combat it's less noticeable. The Xbox also has a more filmic quality to the post-processing, likely a combination of lighting, shadows, and post-process filtering effects. In performance mode, I'd say that both systems trade back and forth enough that neither has a clear lead. In visuals mode, the Xbox aims for 4K and a locked 30 FPS. The Masher Pro is capable of 4K at very high settings and a locked 30 FPS. Resolution appears to be all but identical on both systems, but there are a few other large differences. In this mode, the filmic look seems to have flipped to the PC, leading me to think that it's a combination of lighting, depth of field, and post-processing effects. The PC does pull ahead here, showing better shadows, lighting, and ambient occlusion, and leaving the Xbox looking flatter. In a nice twist compared to most games on the PS4 Pro, the Xbox One X is using what appears to be the highest level textures and anisotropic texture filtering on par with the PC. In fact, in this scene, the large rock on the right appears to be using slightly sharper textures than the PC. That's the only place I noticed a real difference, so it's possible it's just a slow loading texture on the PC, but nevertheless, the Xbox One X and Masher Pro are both delivering a real 4K experience here. Both systems are more or less tied in performance mode, and the Masher Pro has an overall visual lead in visuals mode. HITMAN also offers high frame rate and high quality visual modes, and it uses those names instead of performance and visuals. High quality mode renders at native 4K and locks at 30 FPS. High frame rate mode can run at up to 60 FPS, usually in the mid-50s, but at 1440p resolution instead of the typical 1080p. At 1440p in max settings, the Master Pro is capable of the same, mostly 60 FPS with some drops into the 50s. Visually, the Xbox and Master Pro are very close to identical, with 4 small differences. Textures are slightly, and I mean slightly sharper on the Master Pro, which is likely due to higher levels of texture filtering. Anti-aliasing is a touch better, even though both are at the same base resolution. Shadows and ambient occlusion are slightly higher detail at greater distances, and finally, the overall scene level of detail has a longer draw distance on the Master Pro, but again, these are very slight differences. With the exception of the anti-aliasing, you likely wouldn't notice any of this during normal gameplay. The same is true in high quality mode. Both at native 4K, the two platforms are so close that they might as well be identical. The same exact features are slightly better on the PC, although at this resolution anti-aliasing becomes less necessary, so that gap is even tighter. The amount of detail put into Hitman's open level design is on full display, and regardless of which platform you're on, this game is a treat at 4K. I'm calling this one a tie. Now, recent Forza games have not been well optimized on PC at launch, and the same was true for Forza 7. It's in better shape now, but if I'd recorded footage even a month earlier, there would have been noticeably more bugs on the PC. As it is, the Master Pro is playing at 4K, high settings, and 60 FPS. The Xbox One X is also at 4K and 60 FPS, with some dynamic quality scaling built in. However, most of the time the Xbox looks to be running almost maxed out settings. Aside from a slight color cast difference that could easily be a small dynamic weather difference, there are only 3 differences worth noting. The most noticeable is blockier, less accurate motion blur on the Xbox. At 60 FPS, this isn't going to be apparent in most situations, but in fast lateral movements you can catch what looks like compression artifacts. Lighting is also a bit lower quality on the Xbox, but without a side-by-side comparison, I doubt you'd ever know. Lastly, and this is really a very minor difference, some of the detail levels on some car parts appear to be higher on the PC some of the time. I think it might actually be dynamic scaling on the detail levels that occasionally appears mismatched between the two platforms rather than a real advantage for the PC. A really high-end PC could super sample at 6K or something to increase visual quality, but in practical terms, Forza 7 was optimized around the highest-end Xbox, and the Xbox One X gets just about as much out of it as any regular PC. In my opinion, this is a tie. Now, some of you are probably wondering why I'm reviewing Fortnite and not PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. Well, to be frank, it's a steaming garbage pile of optimization on the Xbox right now, so that would be a pretty short comparison. The PC version's better. That's okay, because the PC version's been out longer and it received quite a few more patches, and I do plan on comparing the two once the Xbox version catches up a bit more. Fortnite Battle Royale renders at 80% of native 4K on the Xbox One X, or about 1870p. It's then upscaled and displayed at native 4K. The cartoonish art style is a perfect candidate for upscaling because the difference between the Xbox at scaled 4K and the Master Pro at true native 4K is so close that the only way I can show the difference is by zooming in on this scene. Even then, we're still looking at a very small difference. The Master Pro is at high settings and locked at 30 FPS. Changing times of day make exact comparisons a bit harder to come by, but to every casual observer, there's no significant difference between the two platforms. The frame rate is rock solid, lighting is nice, effects add a bit more than you'd expect from the art style, and the gameplay is essentially identical. The Xbox does have an unlocked frame rate mode, but most of the time it appears to be just barely better than 30 FPS, and it rarely felt like it got above the mid-40s. To me, that seems more like future-proofing for a more powerful system, which is not at all a bad thing, but I'd leave it locked. I don't mind drops of a few FPS in most games, but large frame rate swings between 30 and 60 in competitive shooters usually won't give you a competitive advantage. The Master Pro can do 1440p at high settings and a locked 60 FPS thanks to its more powerful CPU. Again, thanks to the art style, it isn't that much softer than it appears at 4K. Even on a 4K monitor, I'd probably choose this mode for competitive play. It'd be great if the game added a few scaling options on PC to restore some sharpness and maybe present the UI at native 4K like the Xbox, but given the range of options, I'd still say this is a win for the Master Pro. Fallout 4 isn't the best looking game on any system, and it has its fair share of bugs and inconsistencies to work around. But it's a very popular open world game, and it's a no-brainer for an Xbox One X enhancement patch. This brings native 4K at 30 FPS with some dips in large cities, just like other console versions. The Master Pro is also running at native 4K, high settings, and 30 FPS. Textures, aliasing, lighting, draw distances, and models are essentially identical on both systems. The only real noticeable difference is ambient occlusion. The Xbox uses a basic form of occlusion that looks almost like a post effect. Akin to forcing ambient occlusion in the NVIDIA control panel to a game that doesn't naturally have it, this adds some depth, but it's applied to almost everything, looking neither natural nor pleasing to the eye. In contrast, the Master Pro's ambient occlusion is more realistic, but in my opinion, too heavy-handed. So the Master Pro looks better, but I don't think it looks great. This is most evident when you look at this wide shot of the opening area. The Xbox version has a false lightness that reminds you of old games with no dynamic shadows, whereas the Master Pro muddies the same areas in bland, over-dampened moray of mediocrity, so tie? The Xbox One X doesn't feel like it drops that far below 30 in towns, but I don't have a frame rate counter method for consoles, so I'd trust Digital Foundry over my seat-of-the-pants opinion. On the Master Pro, you do have the option of running 1440p, high settings, and 60 FPS. Even during firefights in cities, no frame rate drops were caught in my play session. Compared to the Xbox, the Master Pro is obviously rendering at a lower resolution when you play at 1440p, but it is at double the frame rate, so a win for the Master Pro. Here we go. One of the most popular tests on the original Potato Masher, one of the best looking open world games, one of the most CPU intensive games I've ever tested, and in my opinion, one of the best games that's ever been created. Everyone should play this game, even if it's in standard definition on a black and white tube TV. But since we can choose between two 4K options, which one's best? At 4K in medium settings, the Master Pro can just barely lock the frame rate at 30 FPS. There's a wide range of vistas in the game, and some are much easier to run than others, but it's at 30 FPS about 99% of the time. The Xbox One X ranges between about 1800p and native 4K, depending on scene complexity. That's high enough to pass as native 4K most of the time, but in direct comparisons the Master Pro is noticeably sharper. Some of this is because I like the game's post-process sharpening set to its medium setting, which is higher than whatever the Xbox is using. This looks slightly over-sharp in some still shots, but it's just about right during gameplay, so I don't think the Xbox is rendering a significantly lower resolution in most of these shots, but it is likely a bit lower in the larger scenes. The Master Pro also is using higher quality textures and texture filtering. The PC version also appears to be color graded to have a somewhat wider dynamic range. Now this is interesting because the Xbox One X has been patched to provide HDR support and the PC hasn't, at least not yet. It's possible that during development of the Xbox One X enhancement patch, CDPR regraded the SDR version of the game, or it's possible that I'm just seeing the difference in the numbers of dynamic lights. I didn't notice this when I first compared the PC and PS4 versions. Both versions look good in this regard, I just noticed a difference and wanted to point it out. One isn't necessarily better than the other, and the Xbox One X does look awesome on my HDR TV. Continuing the positive trend of high frame rate modes, the Xbox has an unlocked mode that ranges from 1080p to 1440p while trying to maintain 60 FPS as often as possible. Supposedly the frame rate still drops into the 40s in Novigrad and Crookback Bog, but it's near 60 many other times. At 1440p in medium settings with no resolution scaling, because it isn't available on the PC version, the Master Pro does a bit better than that. In this scene, the Master Pro appears to have a slight edge in resolution, judging by the cleanliness in the lines on this window. All the other comparisons between the two platforms at 4K still apply here. The Master Pro has better textures and texture filtering, and I'm using the sharpening filter. The Master Pro drops into the mid-50s in large areas or intense scenes, which matches the Xbox's performance most of the time. If you're on a 1080p screen, this mode makes total sense on the Xbox One X. Combat is so much better at 60 FPS. However, on a 4K screen, this mode does look fairly soft on both platforms and a little worse on the Xbox One X. This is a very solid patch on the Xbox, but it's a clear win for the Master Pro. 6 games with 4 wins for the Master Pro and 2 ties. That doesn't tell the whole story, of course. The Xbox One X is a seriously impressive piece of hardware that is at a great price and is without a doubt the most powerful gaming console ever made. While the Master Pro's ancient CPU is still faster than the Xbox's, their GPUs appear to be fairly similar in raw power. The Master Pro's wins come down more to the flexibility of the PC as a platform than they do raw power, although it can also win with raw power most of the time. Like I said at the beginning, none of this is to tell you why you shouldn't buy a console. Buy whatever best fits your gaming needs and your budget. I'll help make recommendations regardless of what you buy. But it's also obvious that you don't need a $1,000 gaming PC to match an Xbox One X. The Master Pro is a creaky old workhorse with a mid-range GPU and it's doing just fine. Want to see more comparisons between the Xbox One X and Master Pro? Hit the subscribe button and make sure you turn on notifications. Enjoy this video so much you want to support me on Patreon? Well, thanks. The link is in the description of this video. Let me know what you thought in the comment section, and have a great day.